Our next speaker is Benjamin Ruddell. We haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I don't think. So he's going to talk about a relation between many different things in relation to land surface ecosystems. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, I apologize. I wasn't here yesterday, and I haven't met most of you before. I'm a relative newcomer to this community. My background's in eco-hydrology. So in fact, my work is in some ways extremely similar, at least in the application context, to the talk you just heard. The work was done primarily at the University of Illinois during my PhD time there. Was published in a series of articles in 2009 and 2010. Some of you may have seen those, most of you probably haven't. So I'd be happy to introduce you to those articles and provide a lot more details. The title of my talk is somewhat misleading in the sense that you can't really talk about or cover all of these things in 20 minutes. I recognize that, and primarily the focus of this talk is on the information theory and statistical information properties of data as measured by flux tower systems that are measuring and focusing on the land surface ecosystem. So I actually use one of the same experimental sites at Ecovariance Flux Towers as was presented in this last talk, the one in Arizona. You'll see some results for that. So with apologies to the physicists in the room, there's actually no physical entropy in this talk. Everything you see is information entropies, and that's an important distinction because we've got so many different entropies flying around. I want you to shift gears into the statistical frame of reference so you can not be confused with my terminology. I'd also like to acknowledge my PhD advisor, Praveen Kumar. He's not here. I don't work with him anymore on this topic, but we still correspond, and I'm now at Arizona State University. So this talk happens in the context of complex systems. How do we analyze complex systems? Well, they're hard to analyze because you have feedback in the systems, you have nonlinearity, you have multi-scalar and hierarchical processes, and perhaps most importantly, one of the key things that I picked out when looking at the program for this session is that I'm dealing with a non-stationary and variable computation of information entropies. So I could also frame this talk as dealing with what happens in a system where it's moving up and down and it's traversing many states. How does the information flow happen in a system like that as opposed to a system that's existing in a steady state average? So one possible solution, and the one that we use to deal with the problem of a complex system of many variables, is to cast it as conceptually as a network of information flow. And that's what we've actually done. So this here is it's a schematic of an eco-hydrology system information flow. And at the smallest scale, within leaves and cells, you have photosynthesis going on and various chemical processes, and those are taking place at very short timescales much shorter than we're able to measure them in the field. And then you've got a spectrum of scales out to the heat exchange, energy exchange processes on the land surface, like sensible heat flux. Then to the atmospheric boundary layer and the atmospheric heat transfer system itself with cloud formation. And then you get all the way up to the global climate scale. So there's a spectrum of scales operating and interacting even on this narrow slice of the Earth system that is the land surface itself. All these couplings are dynamic, so they're all changing in strength. They all have a physical nature to them. They all involve energy transport, but they also have an informational content and information nature, and the strength of the couplings is getting stronger and weaker. The strength of the couplings varies with time scale and spatial scale, and it can change as you follow the diurnal cycle or the seasonal cycles or interannual cycles. So we need to be able to understand how that information flow structure changes. And a question I would pose is, which of these parts of the system is really driving information flow in the system? Is information flowing from the large scales to the small scales? Is it flowing from the small scales to the large scales? Is it flowing both directions? Is it stronger in one direction or the other at certain times? And most particularly, are there emergent properties or similarity principles which can explain how all of that complexity and variability is reduced to a simple, consistent pattern that will allow us to make predictions? And by the end of the talk, I hope to show you that we've at least vaguely identified a couple of similarity principles that can allow you to reduce all of that variability to a simple emergent pattern. I already mentioned I'm dealing with flux towers. So there's a picture of a flux tower. I use FluxNet data. It's a global network of eddy covariance climate towers designed to measure the exchanges of carbon, water, and energy on the land surface. There's a cartoon of the different variables I'm measuring. These are the primary variables that are measured at most flux tower sites. We have the sensible and latent heat fluxes, soil temperature, soil water content. You have incoming solar radiation. You have the net carbon flux, which is typically separated into the incoming and the outgoing carbon fluxes, but those aren't actually measured. You have precipitation, you have the vapor pressure deficit in the atmosphere, and I also use a separate information source to get cloud fractions. So these are various data streams and information sources. The data I use is 30-minute time scale data. So I'm not able to really resolve any processes that happen on a shorter time scale than that. 30 minutes is the standard averaging scale for flux tower data. So you could do this analysis for a finer time scale, and I hope to do that, but I haven't done it yet. The basis of the methodology is, as I mentioned, Shannon information. And of course, the problem when you start talking about Shannon information is actually what is the information content you're measuring. And that ends up being, that's an under-constrained question. Information content you can define it in any number of arbitrary ways. Some of them are more or less physically relevant, but it really depends on the question you're asking. So information answers a question, and in this case, the question I'm asking with my information statistics is, what is the future state of a measured time series variable? Let's call it y. So I want to be able to predict, using past data, a future state of the system. So I'm measuring states of the system, states of things like temperature, and then I'm going to try and predict other states of the system like latent heat flux, or even the future values of temperature based on past values. So I use a Shannon entropy. Many of you are familiar with this. I'm not going to go into the details, except to state that for those of you who haven't run these calculations before, it's computed across the distribution of states. This is an example where there would be 4 states, and if all of the observed values fall into one state, then that's going to have a minimal Shannon entropy because there's no uncertainty in that system. We expect the value to always be in the 4th state, and there's no expectation that it would happen anywhere else. So there's no uncertainty, no Shannon entropy. Also, no possibility of information flow in this system because that system only sits in one state, and therefore we already know the answer to the question. Therefore, no other information can provide us information about the state of the system. Whereas in a system with maximum Shannon entropy, it would be one where you have an equal expectance or probability of each of these 4 states. That's a system where, at least potentially, you could have a lot of information flowing, because information is the answer to the question of which of these states is the system going to visit next. I use the tool of Shannon entropy, transfer entropy. Transfer entropy is something that was derived, it's a mathematical derivative of Shannon entropy, proposed in 2000 by Schreiber. And it's a conditional information flow. And basically, so you can illustrate this accurately with a Venn diagram. What I do is I calculate for 2 time series, x and y. And remember, we're trying to figure out what x tells us about future state of y. I introduce a time lag tau between states of x and states of y. And I look at, if this is the Shannon entropy of x at a time lag in the past, and this is the future entropy of values of y, and those are computed from the distributions, you get this mutual information or information gain, or whatever you want to call it, which is the overlap between those two. It's what past values of x tell you about future values of y. And then I condition that, that mutual information on the immediate 1 time lag history of y. So when I talk about information flow, it is the information provided by 1 time series or set of data about future values of the other across some time lag, conditioned on that other time series y's immediate history. So this is a Markov conditional concept. We are removing the information content that could be provided by the time series' own history. And therefore, given certain assumptions, you can say that this is additional information that's being provided by this one variable to the other. To test the approach, I'll just give you an example where we tested it to see how you can derive this process network. We tested it by looking at 2 different July months measured by Flux Tower in Illinois. This is a corn-soybean ecosystem. And I figured we have an example of drought here where there's a known difference between the healthy system state and the drought state. And one of those differences is that there's far less moisture in the system. Another of those differences is that there's less feedback of water vapor via the atmosphere and the precipitation recycling. We already know that from a lot of literature on the subject. So I figured if this method is effective, we ought to be able to detect that breakdown in moisture feedback using the method and see that in the process network in the information. So this is a statistical exercise, and indeed that's what we see when you look at these 11 variables. During the healthy year, you have all of these feedbacks between this synoptic system, which involves slowly varying and large-scale varying variables, variables that change slowly. And then you have this turbulent system, which is variables. I call that turbulent because it's variables that are associated with the mixing of atmosphere around the land surface. These processes vary very quickly, and they move quickly. And then there's this atmospheric boundary layer subsystem, cloud fraction, precipitation, solar radiation, which are going to vary on other time scales that are in between this quick time scale and the slow time scale. So what you see is there's a lot of two-way information flow. These are statistically significant information flows. That's what the arrows represent. And in particular, the atmospheric boundary layer and the turbulent boundary layer are linked via two-way information flow, coupling precip to these land surface sensible and latent heat fluxes. So that's what we expect. But under the drought conditions here, you have a failure in the two-way flow of information. Now it's just one way, and you have fewer arrows, less information flow, less coupling, And in particular, that's associated with less moisture flowing around in the system. So you have a severing here of this feedback between the land surface and the atmosphere. We can pick that up statistically with the information flow statistic. So far, so good. But I was interested in looking at the system in a broader sense, comparing many ecosystems and looking at the flow of information between timescales. And to do that, I needed a more general measure. So what I do is I cast each variable as a node on a network, and then I use some simple addition and subtraction on this information flow network to come up with gross information production and consumption of each variable. You get those for each time scale. The great thing about this is we can compute a net information production, which is then going to allow us to determine which of the variables in the system is actually creating information and which variables are consuming the information at any given time scale. So I'll give you an example of what this shows us for, again, the same corn-soybean ecosystem. Top row here is the total flow of information in that system, plotted monthly for the years 1998 through 2006. And then second row is the net flow of production of information, that is the difference between this production and consumption of information in a subsystem. Of course, that sums to 0 for all parts of the system because information produced has to be also consumed somewhere else on the network. This is the Shannon entropy of the system, and this is a vegetation index, a MODIS satellite-derived vegetation index telling us how green and productive the system is. So, take-home points. If you look at this, it goes up and down. So information production of the system goes up in the summer when things are growing and when there's a lot of heat and moisture moving around. That's like there. It's July, it peaks. And then it goes down in the winter, and it bottoms out around December, January. No surprise there to somebody who understands how the climate system works. There's just a lot more coupling when things are growing and there's a lot of energy in the system. But that's just a correlation, mind you. Net production of information, this synoptic or slowly varying part of the system, the one associated with the large-scale weather patterns and forcings, is positive as an information producer. It's above the 0 line. That's the pink one. The atmospheric boundary layer and turbulent subsystems are below the 0 line, so they're consumers of information in a net sense. Then if you look at the Shannon entropies, you have the most entropy in this synoptic system, second most in this atmospheric boundary layer, which is the next smaller scale system. And then you have the least entropy in the smallest scale system, this turbulent or plant scale system. So there's a general pattern here that's appearing. And more information, more entropy happens in larger scale, slower varying systems, and it happens when there's more information, more water, more energy. Does this hold true for many systems in the world? Yes, it does. And what I find by comparing a whole palette of different ecosystems measured with flux tower data is that the same pattern holds. And interestingly, a point I want you to note here is well, these are all systems where energy and water availability are more or less in sync, and you see for all of these that the maximum information production and entropy shows up when you have the most thermal energy and the most water vapor availability in the system. But for systems like Arizona and California, where you don't have the energy and water availability in sync, you still see that it's true, that it shows up when there's the most thermal and water resources available. But it's not necessarily true in those systems that there's the most information and entropy production, Shannon entropy, when there's the most energy in the system. There has to be water and energy. It turns out that there's a emergent or fairly universal similarity principle that shows up when you look at all of these systems. So this is a plot of the total transport, total information production in the system against the Shannon entropy, average Shannon entropy of a given month. So this is monthly data for about 10 years for 8 different ecosystems, ranging from the Arctic to the tropics. And what we find is that there's a simple exponential curve here that fits more or less that progression. And so you get these systems varying from low information production for low average Shannon entropy up to high information production for high Shannon entropy. And all the systems follow the same curve. Interestingly, none of them exceed about 0.65 or 0.7 of the maximum possible entropy on average. And I think that's an interesting question. I won't answer why that is. There's another principle that shows up. And here I need to explain, in a second I need to explain how these two are different. But this one I call the information production hypothesis, which means it seems like the system's trying to produce more information, and it's doing that when there's more entropy. This is the moderate entropy hypothesis, which actually says that if we separate out the different subsystems by scale of how fast they vary, large scale versus small scale, we see that there's this net information flow from the large scale to the small scale systems. And so this is a plot. On this axis is net information flow. So things above the line are net producers, things below are net consumers. Same colors as before. This is the synoptic scale slow-moving system. This is the medium scale boundary layer system. This is the local fast scale system. So what we see is there's net flow from the slow to the fast. And you see that the slow tends to occupy this very high entropy range. This lower axis is entropy, average Shannon entropy. These tend to be highly varying, and this tends to be a moderately varying subsystem. And again, these patterns show up for all ecosystems we study during all months. It's the same pattern. So it's another similarity principle. The difference is between those two principles that we have two different sets of assumptions in the definition of local and global. This boils down to the bounds of variability. So everything I've been talking about is purely statistical in nature, except for one thing. When I set up my distributions, which are the basis for my information calculations, I set a minimum and a maximum. See, here's a picture where you have a variation in time series. There's a maximum value, there's a minimum value for this variable. Now there's two ways, at least two ways you can do that. One of them is to look at the minimum and maximum value that a variable visits over the entire record of the data. I'll call that the global or long-term bounds of variability. The other way to do it is to look at the local or short-term bounds of variability. In this case, that would be on a monthly time scale. So I could do it one way or the other. And I did it both. So this principle emerges from the long-term bounds of variability, the IPH. This principle emerges from the short-term bounds of variability. So the take-home message there is that it appears on the long term these systems are organizing themselves to maximize information production in aggregate. And that happens when entropy, Shannon entropy, is maximized. But at in any given time of the year, the system is reorganizing itself around a moderate production of information, a maximization of feedback, and a net flow of information from slowly varying to rapidly varying systems. So we have a long-term dynamic. Systems organized around long-term bounds of variability. It's also organized around local short-term bounds of variability. And both principles appear to be universal across all these subsystems and ecosystems. So I'll pose a couple of questions based on this work. This is not finished work. I think there's some important things that need to be done. I'd like to test the hypothesis that these two principles can be shown to apply to broad classes of complex systems. I would hypothesize that they can be shown to apply to all systems that both vary in time, that is, they're not steady state, not average, and which also feature feedback. So I'd like to test that. I'd also like to test the hypothesis that perhaps by comparing these results with physical entropy production, I'd like to test the hypothesis that the physical entropies correlate in terms of their maxima with the information production entropies that I'm observing. I think that would be very interesting to test. I have another hypothesis or research idea here. Based on this physical assumption that is the local and the global bounds of variability on the system, and the fact that I've uncovered this similarity principle, I believe that it should be possible to use these similarity principles to predict what will happen when you move the bounds of variability. So if all systems, regardless of their bounds, are following these two principles, and you move the bounds, they're still going to follow the principles. So we ought to be able to use that to predict the reorganization of ecosystems when they have non-stationary changes in their boundary conditions. And that would help with climate change applications, for example. I'll stop there and just mention in closing that I'm looking for collaborators on this topic because I think there's connections to a lot of other entropy work. And I also have a new software package which computes this stuff. And I'd be happy to share that with anyone who wants to use it to compute these information quantities.
Okay, thank you for a very nice talk. Questions?
Probably I have missed that. How do you normalize to the inflow of entropy in your system? Of course, if you have no rain over a very long period, the entropy, the inflowing entropy into the system is much smaller than if you have daily changing weather conditions. But since you have the weather as intrinsic component of your model, you have somehow to take that into account.
Yeah, good question. So it's not physical entropy. You use the word entropy. I assume you mean Shannon entropy. It all boils down to these bounds of variability. So in a system where in a given month there was no rain, the bounds of variability, the local bounds of variability on the rainfall or precip variable would be between 0 and 0. I would actually have to drop that from the analysis then because that fails statistically. But it's a fact that in some months are going to have much wider ranges of variability than others, and that's going to be true of all variables in all months. So what I do is I take local bounds, that is within the month, and then I will also take a global bounds over the long term of the data. And I normalize to those two different physical conditions when I'm computing my information content. There are other ways to do it, but those assumptions allow me to test a hypothesis that the system's actually organizing itself on both long and short time scales. Probably I could do a better job if I had more short-term and rapidly varying data. I could push that assumption down to smaller time scales, and I could also push it to longer terms of evolution if I had 1,000 years of long-term data. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Benjamin, as somebody who both thinks that global warming is real and that it's anthropogenic, I'd be interested in your comments on how you think your work could be used for ecosystem management or the effective interventions in ecosystems like deforestation and temperature variation on deaths of coral reefs such as the Great Barrier Reef, all that sort of thing, which, I mean, this is lovely science, but science can be turned into technology. What are your comments? What do you think your future is there?
Yeah, so I've spent the last 3 years submitting a couple of proposals on this, which keep getting turned down. Possibly by people in this room, possibly not. Well, I say this with a full recognition of that fact. One of them pertains to looking at the sensitivity of information production to variation in specific variables that I'm measuring in the system, and I think that you can actually use that to understand the sensitivity of these different ecosystems to specific types of changes in the bounds of variability or in the average values of specific variables, like temperature. More generally, I think it should be possible, and this is a couple steps of research that would be required to get there, but by drawing a direct linkage between these similarity principles and the physical production of entropy, we ought to be able to predict how, not just on average with physical entropy production, but how specifically with respect to individual variables these systems reorganize themselves when you change the bounds of variability. And I think that would allow you to get to carbon production and ecosystem productivity, things like that, and understand how they will reorganize themselves when you change the bounds of variability. That's the goal. You know, it's kind of ambitious, but that's how I think it could apply.
Any more questions? I had a question actually. Very interested in your transfer entropy that you talked about, which I haven't seen before, so thank you for that. I see in your formulation it's based on a time scale, tau. I'm just very curious of how you choose that. Maybe you did mention that, but I missed that. And do we need only one time scale? Are there multiple time scales, etc.? So,
yeah. So I've got about 100 more slides on that, and for a general audience like this, I dropped it. What I do is I'm constrained by the data, mind you. So I need to generate accurate entropy estimates, and that's why I choose a month, because that gives me enough data at a 30-minute time scale to do that. If I had a better method of estimation, which I think Dr. Garcia is going to talk about later, I think this afternoon, I think he has some better ways of doing that. I could push that down. The long and the short of it is I start with a time lag of 30 minutes because that's the minimum I can use with 30-minute data. I'm looking at adjacent data values. And then I increment that by 30 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, all the way out to as far as I can get before I eat through all my data by consuming it with a time lag. So in this research, I looked at all time lags from 30 minutes to 18 hours.
Okay. So you did do it autocorrelation. You didn't just choose one time.
That's right. I did, and there's a lot of very interesting and rich results for how net information flow varies with time of day and with time lag and all that.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Thank Benjamin very much.